Get cozy because it's time for some more politically correct bedtime stories. Slip into some PJs, get you some hot cocoa or some warm milk, a glass of wine, whatever you prefer. Get comfy, get cozy, and let's read. So, if you've been watching this little series, I've already done 2 videos. The first video we did Little Red Riding Hood, The Emperor's New Clothes, and the 3 Little Pigs. The second one we did Rumpelstiltskin, the 3 Codependent Goats, Gruff, and Rapunzel. And I think this one we will be doing Cinderella, Goldilocks, and Snow White. So let's get started. Cinderella. There once lived a young woman named Cinderella, whose natural birth mother had died when Cinderella was but a child. A few years after, her father married a widow with 2 older daughters. Cinderella's mother of step treated her very cruelly, and her sisters of step made her work very hard, as if she were their own personal unpaid laborer. One day, an invitation arrived at their house. The prince was celebrating his exploitation of the dispossessed and marginalized peasantry by throwing a fancy dress ball. Cinderella's sisters of step were very excited to be invited to the palace. They began to plan the expensive clothes they would use to alter and enslave their natural body images to emulate an unrealistic standard of feminine beauty. It was especially unrealistic in their case, as they were differently visioned enough to stop a clock. Her mother of step also planned to go to the ball, so Cinderella was working harder than a dog, an appropriate, if unfortunately specious, metaphor. When the day of the ball arrived, Cinderella helped her mother and sisters of step into their ball gowns, a formidable task. It was like trying to force 10 pounds of processed non-human animal carcasses into a 5-pound skin. Next came immense cosmetic augmentation, which it would be best not to describe it at all. As evening fell, her mother and sisters of step left Cinderella at home to finish her housework. Cinderella was sad, but she contented herself with her Holly Near records. Suddenly, there was a flash of light, and in front of Cinderella stood a man dressed in loose-fitting, all-cotton clothes and wearing a wide-brimmed hat. At first, Cinderella thought he was a Southern lawyer or a band leader, but he soon put her straight. "Hello, Cinderella! I am your fairy god person, or individual deity proxy, if you prefer. So, you want to go to the ball, eh? And bind yourself into the male concept of beauty? Squeeze into some tight-fitting dress that will cut off your circulation? Jam your feet into high-heel shoes that will ruin your bone structure? Paint your face with chemicals and makeup that have been tested on non-human animals?" "Oh yes, definitely," she said in an instant. Her fairy godperson heaved a great sigh and decided to put off her political education till another day. With his magic, he enveloped her in a beautiful bright light and whisked her away to the palace. Many, many carriages were lined up outside the palace that night. Apparently, no one had ever thought of carpooling. Soon, in a heavy gilded carriage painfully pulled by a team of horse slaves, Cinderella arrived. She was dressed in a clinging gown woven of silk stolen from unsuspecting silkworms. Her hair was festooned with pearls plundered from hard-working, defenseless oysters, and on her feet, dangerous though it may seem, she wore slippers made of finely cut crystal. Every head in the ballroom turned as Cinderella entered. The men stared at and lusted after this woman who had captured perfectly their Barbie doll ideas of feminine desirability. The women, trained at an early age to despise their own bodies, looked at Cinderella with envy and spite. Cinderella's own mother and sisters of step, consumed with jealousy, failed to recognize her. Cinderella soon caught the roving eye of the prince, who was busy discussing jousting and bear baiting with his cronies. Upon seeing her, the prince was struck with a fit of not being able to speak, as well as the majority of the population. "Here," he thought, "is a woman that I could make my princess and impregnate with the progeny of our perfect genes, and thus make myself the envy of every other prince for miles around. And she's blonde, too." The prince began to cross the ballroom towards his intended prey. His cronies also began to walk towards Cinderella. So did every other male in the ballroom who was younger than 70 and not serving drinks. Cinderella was proud of the commotion she was causing. She walked with head high and carried herself like a woman of eminent social standing. But soon it became clear that the commotion was turning into something ugly, or at least socially dysfunctional. The prince had made it clear to his friends that he was intent on possessing the young woman. But the prince's resoluteness angered his pals, for they too lusted after her and wanted to own her. The men began to shout and push each other. The prince's best friend, who was a large, if cerebrally constrained duke, stopped him halfway across the dance floor and insisted that he was going to have Cinderella. The prince's response was a swift kick to the groin, which left the duke temporarily inactive. But the prince was quickly seized by other sex-crazed males, and he disappeared into a pile of human animals. The women were appalled by this vicious display of testosterone, but try as they might, they were unable to separate the combatants. To the other women, it seemed that Cinderella was the cause of all the trouble, so they encircled her and began to display very unsisterly hostility. She tried to escape, but her impractical glass slippers made it nearly impossible. Fortunately for her, none of the other women were shod any better. The noise grew so loud that no one heard the clock in the tower chime midnight. When the ball rang the 12th time, Cinderella's beautiful gown and slippers disappeared, and she was dressed once again in her peasant rags. Her mother and sisters of step recognized her now, but kept quiet to avoid embarrassment. The women grew silent at this magical transformation. Freed from the confinements of her gown and slippers, Cinderella sighed and stretched and scratched her ribs. She smiled, closed her eyes, and said, "Kill me now if you want, sisters, but at least I'll die in comfort." The women around her again grew envious, but this time they took a different approach. Instead of exacting vengeance on her, they stripped off their bodices, corsets, shoes, and every other confining garment. They danced and jumped and screeched in sheer joy, comfortable at last in their shifts and bare feet. Had the men looked up from their macho dance of destruction, they would have seen many desirable women, dressed as if for the boudoir, but they never ceased pounding, punching, kicking, and clawing at each other until, to the last man, they were dead. The women clucked their tongues but felt no remorse. The palace and realm were theirs now. Their first official act was to dress the men in their discarded dresses and tell the media that the fight arose when someone threatened to expose the cross-dressing tendencies of the prince and his cronies. Their second was to set up a clothing co-op that produced only comfortable, practical clothes for women. Then they hung a sign over the castle advertising Cinderwear, for that was what the new clothing was called. And through self-determination and clever marketing, they all, even the mother and sisters of step, lived happily ever after. The end. Okay, so the next story is Goldilocks. Through the thicket, across the river, and deep, deep in the woods, lived a family of bears. A papa bear, a mama bear, and a baby bear. And they all lived together anthropomorphically in a little cottage as a nuclear family. They were very sorry about this, of course, since the nuclear family has traditionally served to enslave women, instill a self-righteous moralism in its members, and imprint rigid notions of heterosexualist roles onto the next generation. Nevertheless, they tried to be happy and took steps to avoid these pitfalls, such as naming their offspring the non-gender specific baby. One day in their little anthropomorphic cottage, they sat down to breakfast. Papa Bear had prepared big bowls of all natural porridge for them to eat. But straight off the stove, the porridge was too thermally enhanced to eat. So they left their bowls to cool and took a walk to visit their animal neighbors. After the bears left, a melanin impoverished young woman emerged from the bushes and crept up to the cottage. Her name was Goldilocks, and she had been watching the bears for days. She was, you see, a biologist who specialized in the study of anthropomorphic bears. At one time, she had been a professor, but her aggressive, masculine approach to science, ripping off the thin veil of nature, exposing its secrets, penetrating its essence, using it for her own selfish needs, and bragging about such violations in the letters columns of various magazines, had led to her dismissal. The rogue biologist had been watching the cottage for some time. Her intent was to collar the bears with radio transmitters and then follow them in their migratory and other life patterns with an utter disregard for their personal, or rather, animal privacy. With scientific espionage the only thing in mind, Goldilocks broke into the bear's cottage. In the kitchen, she laced the bowls of porridge with a tranquilizing potion. Then, in the bedroom, she rigged snares beneath the pillows of each bed. Her plan was to drug the bears, and when they stumbled into their bedroom to take a nap, lash radio collars to their necks as their heads hit the pillows. Goldilocks chortled and thought, these bears will be my ticket to the top. I'll show those twerps at the university the kind of guts it takes to do real research. She crouched in a corner of the bedroom and waited. And waited. And waited some more. But the bears took so long to come back from their walk that she fell asleep. When the bears finally came home, they sat down to eat breakfast. Then they stopped. Papa Bear asked, "Does your porridge smell off, Mama?" Mama Bear replied, "Yes, it does. Does yours smell off, baby?" Baby Bear said, "Yes, it does. It smells kind of chemically." Suspicious, they rose from the table and went into the living room. Papa Bear sniffed. He asked, "Do you smell something else, Mama?" Mama Bear replied, "Yes, I do. Do you smell something else, baby?" Baby Bear said, "Yes, I do. It smells musky and sweaty and not at all clean." They moved into the bedroom with growing alarm. Papa Bear asked, "Do you see a snare and a radio collar under my pillow, Mama?" Mama Bear replied, "Yes, I do. And I see a snare and radio collar under my pillow." "Baby?" And Baby Bear said, "Yes, I do. And I see the human who put them there." Baby Bear pointed in the corner to where Goldilocks slept. The bears growled and Goldilocks woke with a start. She sprang up and tried to run, but Papa Bear caught her with a swing of his paw, and Mama Bear did the same. With Goldilocks now a mobility non-professor, Mama and Papa Bear sat on her with fang and claw. They gobbled her up, and soon there was nothing left of the maverick biologist but a bit of yellow hair and a clipboard. Baby Bear watched with astonishment. When they were done, Baby Bear asked, "Mama? Papa? What have you done? I thought we were vegetarians." Papa Bear burped. "We are," he said. "But we're always ready to try new things. Flexibility is just one more benefit of being multicultural." The end. And then the last story is Snow White. Once there was a young princess who was not at all unpleasant to look at and had a temperament that many found to be more pleasant than most other people's. Her nickname was Snow White, indicative of the discriminatory notions of associating pleasant or attractive qualities with light and unpleasant or unattractive qualities with darkness. Thus, at an early age, Snow White was an unwitting, if fortunate, target for this type of colorist thinking. When Snow White was quite young, her mother was suddenly stricken ill, grew more advanced in non-health, and finally was rendered non-viable. Her father, the king, grieved for what can be considered a healthy period of time, then asked another woman to be his queen. Snow White did her best to please her new mother of step, but a cold distance remained between them. The queen's prized possession was a magic mirror that would answer truthfully any question asked it. Now, years of social conditioning in a male hierarchical dictatorship had left the queen very insecure about her own self-worth. Physical beauty was the one standard she cared about now, and she defined herself solely in regard to her personal appearance. So every morning the queen would ask her mirror, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest one of all?" Her mirror would answer, "For all it's worth, O my queen, your beauty is the fairest to be seen." That dialogue went on regularly until once, when the queen was having a bad hair day and was desperately in need of support, she asked the usual question and the mirror answered, "Alas, if worth be based on beauty, Snow White has surpassed you, cutie." At this, the queen flew into a rage. The chance to work with Snow White to form a strong bond of sisterhood had long passed. Instead, the queen indulged in an adopted masculine power trip and ordered the royal woodsperson to take Snow White into the forest and kill her. And possibly to impress the males in the royal court, she barbarously ordered that the girl's heart be cut out and brought back to her. The woodsperson sadly agreed to these orders and led the girl, who was now actually a young woman, into the middle of the forest. But his connections to the earth and seasons had made him a kind soul, and he couldn't bear to harm the girl. He told Snow White of the oppressive and unsisterly order of the queen and told her to run as deeply as she could into the forest. The frightened Snow White did as she was told. The woodsperson, fearing the queen's wrath but unwilling to take another life merely to indulge her vanity, went into town and had the candy maker concoct a heart of red marzipan. When he presented this to the queen, she hungrily devoured the heart in a sickening display of pseudo-cannibalism. Meanwhile, Snow White ran deep into the woods. Just when she thought she had fled as far as she could from civilization and its unhealthy influences, she stumbled upon a cottage. Inside, she saw 7 tiny beds, set in a row and all unmade. She also saw 7 sets of dishes piled high in the sink and 7 barca loungers in front of 7 remote-controlled TVs. She surmised that the cottage belonged to either 7 little men or 1 sloppy numerologist. The beds looked so inviting that the tired youngster curled up on one and immediately fell asleep. When she awoke several hours later, she saw the faces of 7 bearded, vertically challenged men surrounding the bed. She sat up with a start and gasped. One of the men said, "You see that? Just like a flighty woman, resting peacefully one minute and screaming the next." "I agree," said another. "She'll disrupt our strong bond of brotherhood and create competition among us for her affections. I say we throw her in the river in a sack full of rocks." "I agree we should get rid of her," said a third. "But why degrade the ecology? Let's just feed her to a bear or something and let her become part of the food chain." "Hear, hear." "Sound thinking, brother." When Snow White finally regained her senses, she begged, "Please, please don't kill me. I mean no harm by sleeping on your bed. I thought no one would ever notice." "Ah, you see," said one of the men, "female preoccupations are already surfacing. She's complaining that we don't make our beds." "Kill her, kill her." "Please, no," she cried. "I've traveled so deep into these woods because my mother of step, the queen, ordered me killed." "See that? Internecide female vindictiveness. Don't try and play the victim with us, kid." "Quiet," boomed one of the men, who had flaming red hair and a non-human animal skin on his head. Snow White quickly realized that he was their leader and that her fate rested in his hands. "Explain yourself. What's your name and why have you really come here?" "My name is Snow White," she began, "and I've already told you. My mother of step, the queen, ordered a woodsperson to take me into the forest and kill me. But he took pity and told me to run away into the woods as far as I could." "Just like a woman," grumbled one of the men under his breath. "Get a man to do all our dirty work." The leader held up his hands for silence. He said, "Well, Snow White, if that's your story, I guess we'll have to believe you." Snow White was beginning to resent her treatment, but tried not to let it show. "And who are you guys anyway?" "We are known as the 7 Towering Giants," said the leader. Snow White's suppression of a giggle did not go unnoticed. The leader continued, "We are towering in spirit, and so are giants among the men of the forest. We used to earn our living by digging in our mines, but we decided that such a rape of the planet was immoral and short-sighted. Besides, the bottom fell out of the metals market. And now we are dedicated stewards of the earth and live here in harmony with nature. To make ends meet, we also conduct retreats for men who need to get in touch with their primitive masculine identities. So what does that involve? Asked Snow White, aside from drinking milk straight from the carton. Your sarcasm is ill-advised, warned the leader of the 7 towering giants. My fellow giants want to get rid of your corrupting feminine presence, and I might not be able to stop them. Understand? My men, we must speak our hearts openly and honestly. Let us adjourn to the sweat lodge. The 7 little men scampered off out the front door, whooping and stripping off their clothes. Snow White didn't know what to do while waiting. For fear of stepping on anything that might be scurrying about amid the debris on the floor, she stayed on the bed, although she did manage to make it without ever stepping off. Snow White heard drumming and shouts, and soon after, the 7 towering giants came back into the cottage. They didn't smell as bad as she thought they would, and thankfully, they all wore loincloths. Ah, look what she's done to my bed. I want her out of here. I want to change my vote. Calm down, brother, said the leader. Don't you see? This is just what we were talking about. Contrasts. We can better measure our progress as true men if there is a female around for comparison. The men grumbled among themselves about the wisdom of this decision. But Snow White had had enough. I resent being kept around like an object, just a yardstick for your egos and penises. Fair enough, said the leader. You're free to make your way back through the woods. Give our regards to the queen. Well, I guess I can stay until I figure out a new plan, she said. Very well, said the leader, but we have a few ground rules. No dusting, no straightening up, and no rinsing out underwear in the sink. And no peeking in the sweat lodge. And stay away from our drums. Meanwhile, back at the castle, the queen rejoiced at the thought of her rival in beauty had been eliminated. She puttered around her boudoir reading Glamour and Elle and indulged herself with 3 whole pieces of chocolate without purging. Later, she confidently strolled up to her magic mirror and asked her same sad question. Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest one of all? The mirror replied, Your weight is perfect for your shape and height, but for sheer oomph, you can't beat Snow White. At this news, the queen clenched her fist and screamed at the top of her lungs. For years, her insecurities had been eating away at her until now they turned her into someone who was morally out of the mainstream. With cunning and malice, she began to devise a plan to ensure the non-viability of her daughter of step. A few days later, Snow White, to be sure she didn't touch or rearrange anything, was meditating on the floor in the middle of the cottage. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. Snow White opened the door to find a chronically gifted woman with a basket in her hand. By the look of her clothes, she was apparently unfettered by the confines of regular employment. Help a woman of unreliable income, dearie, she said, and buy one of my apples. Snow White thought for a moment. In protest against agribusiness conglomerates, she had a personal rule against buying food from middle persons. But her heart went out to the economically marginalized woman, so she said yes. What Snow White didn't know was that this was really the queen in disguise, and that the apple had been chemically and genetically altered so that whoever bit it would sleep forever. When Snow White handed over the money for the apple, you would have expected the queen to be gleeful that her plan for revenge was working. Instead, she looked at Snow White's fine complexion and slim, taut body. She felt alternating waves of envy and self-revulsion. Finally, she burst into tears. Why, whatever is the matter? Asked Snow White. You're so young and beautiful, sobbed the disguised queen, and I'm horrible to look at and getting worse. You shouldn't say that. After all, beauty comes from inside a person. I've been telling myself that for years, said the queen, and I still don't believe it. How do you stay in such perfect shape? Well, I meditate, work out, and step aerobics 3 hours a day, and eat only half portions of anything placed in front of me. Would you like me to show you?" "Oh yes, yes, please," said the queen. So they started out with 30 minutes of simple hatha yoga meditation, then worked out on this step for another hour. As they relaxed afterwards, Snow White cut her apple in half and gave a piece to the queen. Without thinking, the queen bit into it, and both of them fell into a deep sleep. Later that day, the 7 towering giants returned from a retreat in the woods, elaborately decked out in animal skins, feathers, and mud. With them was a prince from a nearby kingdom who had come on this male retreat to find a cure for his impotence, or as he preferred to call it, his involuntary suspension from phallocentric activity. They were all laughing and high-fiving until they saw the bodies and stopped short. "What has happened?" asked the prince. "Apparently, our house guest and this other woman got into some sort of cat fight and killed each other," surmised one giant. "If they thought that by doing this they could make us slaves to our weaker emotions, they're wrong," fumed another. "Well, as long as we have to dispose of them, let's practice one of those Viking funerals we read about." "You know," said the prince, "this might sound a little sick, but I trust you guys. I find the younger one attractive. Extremely attractive. Would you fellows mind, waiting outside while I—" "Stop right there," said the leader of the giants. "Those half-eaten apple pieces, that filthy costume. This has all the earmarks of some sort of magic spell. They're not really dead at all." "Whew," sighed the prince, "that makes me feel better. So could you guys take 5 and let me—" "Hold it, prince," said the leader. "Does Snow White make you feel like a man again?" "She certainly does. Now, could you guys—" "Don't touch her. You'll break the spell." The leader thought for a minute and said, "My brothers and I see certain economic possibilities arising from this. If we kept Snow White around here in this state, we could advertise our retreats as impotency therapy." The giants nodded in agreement with this idea, but the prince interrupted. "But what about me? I've already paid for my retreat. Why don't I get to, take the cure?" "No dice, prince," said the leader. "You can look, but don't touch. Otherwise, you'll break the spell. Tell you what, though. You can have the other one if you want." "I don't want to sound classist," said the prince, "but she's not high enough caliber for me." "That's pretty big talk from a man shooting blanks," said one of the giants, and everybody but the prince laughed. The leader said, "Come on, brothers, let's lift these 2 off the floor and decide how we can best display them." It took 3 giants for each female, but they managed to get both bodies aloft. As soon as they did, however, the pieces of poison apple fell from the mouths of Snow White and the queen, and they awoke from the spell. "What do you think you're doing? Put us down!" they shouted. The giants were so startled they almost dropped the women to the floor. "That was the most sickening thing I've ever heard," shouted the queen, "offering us around like pieces of property." "And you," said Snow White to the prince, "trying to make it with a girl in a coma? Yuck!" "Hey, don't blame me," said the prince. "It's a medical condition." The leader of the giants said, "Don't start tossing blame around. You both broke into our property in the first place. I can call the police." "Don't try it, Napoleon," said the queen. "This forest is property of the crown. You are the ones who are trespassing." This rejoinder caused quite a stir, but not as big a commotion as when the queen warned. "And another thing. While we were immobile and you all blathered on in your sexist way, I had a personal awakening. From now on, I'm going to dedicate my life to healing the rift between women's souls and their bodies. I'm going to teach women to accept their natural body images and become whole again. Snow White and I are going to build a women's spa and conference center on this very spot where we can hold retreats, caucuses, and ovariums for the sisters of our world." There was much shouting and name-calling, but the queen eventually had her way. Before the 7 towering giants could be evicted from their home, though, they packed up their sweat lodge and moved deeper into the woods. The prince stayed on at the spa as a cute but harmless tennis pro. And Snow White and the Queen became good friends and earned worldwide fame for their contributions to sisterhood. The giants were never heard from again, save for little muddy footprints that were sometimes found in the morning outside the windows of the spa's locker room. The end. So, which story was y'all's favorite? Comment down below and let me know. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, give me a big thumbs up. If you'd like to see more of these stories, click that subscribe button down below. And until next time, remember to always be completely you. Bye!